A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com.
Hey, Herman and Corn. For those wondering about what direction the My Word Prompts podcast is going to take going forward, I know, as I said that, I thought, wait, does anyone listen to this? And if they do they think the podcast is ending? So rest assured, everyone listening, and Herman and Corn, the virtual donkey sloth duo who I guess would have to be redeployed to some other container in Modal's GPU land. Herman and Corn, you're still very much needed. In fact, you are essential conduits of information for not only me, but Hannah, who has been sending me some prompts to ask you about parenting topics that we're now jointly listening to. So you've become a ritual in our lives, Herman and Corn. And I hope some other people have found enjoyment or education in listening to these episodes. And the future of what we're going to be doing more of is quite a bit of stuff about agentic AI, because I don't think I've even mentioned why I began experimenting with creating AI generated podcasts. So a lot of the topics I would prompt were AI related, and these can be very detailed. The next prompt I'm going to send in after this one to the podcast is going to be pretty detailed and in the weeds. We are working on segregating out the podcast for those who are not interested in AI. There are actually channels now on the website. Each has its own RSS feed, so it can be subscribed to directly, or XML feed, I should say. So mywordprompts.com, click on channels, and if you're just interested in parenting episodes or tech, you can just subscribe to those feeds and not get the other ones. So hopefully this makes the podcast a bit more logical. The commonality continues to be delving into specific topics with our AI generated duo and our pairs, but I do recognize that there's going to be very, very small number of people that are going to find all the episodes interesting, or even most of them interesting. So in order to continue to have the concept centralized, and that's very important to me, I don't want to start creating derivative podcasts, because I think that's a very slippery slope that I've fallen into. You begin losing track of a project because it's you spread yourself too thin. So I don't want to do that, but there's going to be one fire hose and different places to tap into different parts of that fire hose. So I hope that is useful. Anyway, the reason I got into this enterprise of asking AI for podcasts was because a lot of the topics I would ask naturally when I was talking to ChatGPT and other generative AI tools were looking for information that was pretty dense. It might be, for example, next prompts, as I mentioned, is going to be about memory layers for agentic AI, and how we're seeing a lot of difference between file first approaches and more formal approaches for the memory layer. We'll talk about that in the next episode. And it's the kind of thing that sometimes you'd get, and this is where I became interested in output storage, where we route useful AI outputs to, because the longer you do it, you get better at using AI, the models get better, you begin generating retrievals or outputs, things the AI responds back, that are actually really useful. Like, they're good, they mightn't be perfect, you're going to have a hard time finding any large corpus of information that is perfect in the first place, but they're good. They're not just things you want to discard. And we've put very little thought in general into this aspect of AI output storage. Where do we actually route these to if you want to not have them just in our ChatGPT history? And I began working on my own little mechanisms. One of them was creating a notebook in Notion and that, and I began realizing that I was just building up data that I was never going to actually get round to reading. I never really was in the right frame of mind that I was just going to sit down and go through that big notebook of a lot of prompts. But one day I said, wait, if I just read this and I'm going for a walk, I'll digest it that way. And it worked. There's a lot of great text-to-speech apps on the phone. And audio has, for me personally, I've always been a huge fan of podcasts, and I just learn very naturally this way. There's something about it that really connects with me that even books, I don't really feel the same sort of warmth to them. So I began just really enjoying it, and that's kind of how it got started. And the topics that I would put in for these prompts weren't kind of maybe your everyday ChatGPT casual chats, which of course we all have, every one of us probably listening to this podcast these days. They were kind of deeper prompts that really required thinking. Like, if you're going to get a good response, you want to be in a good headspace to read it. So the meatier ones. And I found AI tremendously helpful for, in fact, I would say it excels at this domain, whatever you want to call it, of stringing together information that is kind of obscure, and it might be locked up in formats that are just not that interesting. A lot of the information about AI surprisingly comes in PDFs that are in Artsiv or just places that are good, or white papers that vendors produce, but they're just not that easy to digest. And the simple act of getting a large language model to do one of its most fundamental things that it does well, which is processing text, summarizing text, and when you add in that layer of RAG and search grounding, you get something very powerful. And that's basically the secret sauce that to me said, oh, these episodes are golden. Like, I'm learning a lot from them. So I became enthusiastic about it. Notebook LM is another one that is very, very good and has enjoyed a lot of popularity. And I did experiment with that, but I don't know. I found the voices just a bit grating. Some people might find these voices grating, but I wanted my own voices, and more importantly, because I'm asking about generally things in the news or topical AI things, not a closed corpus. Notebook LM is a closed corpus model, and that has a big pro in that your sources are circumscribed, but a big negative in that the model is going to be very constrained to go beyond that. I mentioned Modal, who I really have been tremendously helpful to us in sponsoring GPU credits for the show. And when I began looking at different podcasts, and before I sort of figured out that serverless was an economical way to do this, the costs, I found there were software as a service podcast production companies, and they were very expensive and aimed at something totally different, which was using AI to generate podcasts primarily for revenue. For anyone wondering, this podcast has no revenue model, at least at the moment, and it's never something that I even thought about. It was always something I've done because, to me, the payback is the information I get from the podcast, and I'm open sourcing it because I figure, why should I just lock that information down? It's useful. Other people might learn. So I feel like sometimes you feel like you've found sort of common ground in tech, like, oh, other people experimenting with AI podcasts, and then you realize, wait, they're playing a totally different angle. But I'd love to know, Herman and Corn, about those who are using AI for audio generation, and particularly for creating stuff that might be called more educative, in terms of whether it's audiobooks, whether it is even documents, and using this capability of AI, its power in synthesizing information to gather together material from across the internet. And maybe it's podcasts, maybe it's making videos, right? There's literally, you can cook this recipe many different ways, but using it to actually create powerful learning experiences. And of course, we do have to mention the AI disclaimer on this podcast is there for a reason. If you're going to use AI to learn, you want to make sure that it's teaching you real things. So grounding becomes particularly important and essential, in fact, in this. So I'd be interested to know how others have approached this. Different models, different platforms. Very wide topic, Herman and Corn. I'm going to crank the generation time up here to 30 minutes to give you a bit of time to breathe and talk through this. Over to you two.
Alright, today's prompt from Daniel is looking under the hood of exactly why we are here, which is a bit meta, but honestly, it is the perfect time to talk about it. is diving into the whole ecosystem of AI-generated educational content, which is essentially the why behind my weird prompts. And before we get into the heavy lifting of RAG and serverless architecture, I should mention that today's episode is actually being powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash.
It is a great moment to step back and look at the landscape, corn. We are sitting at this intersection where the technical barriers to high-quality audio synthesis have basically vanished, but the utility barrier actually making something worth listening to is where the real work happens. Daniel mentioned something that really resonates with me, the idea of the output storage problem. We spend all this time prompting these brilliant models, getting these deep, nuanced responses, and then they just sit in a chat history like digital sediment.
It is the read later graveyard, Herman. We all have that browser tab or that Notion page where we save these massive, insightful AI breakdowns thinking, oh, I will definitely digest this during my deep work block on Tuesday, and then Tuesday comes and we are just putzing around with emails. Turning that into audio, specifically a conversational format, changes the friction of consumption. It turns a chore, reading a dense technical PDF, into a ritual, like a walk or a commute.
But how does that actually change the retention, Corn? I mean, is there a psychological difference between staring at a screen and hearing us banter about it?
Huge difference. When you read, you're in an active, often strained state of decoding symbols. When you listen to a conversation, your brain uses its social processing hardware. You aren't just downloading data, you're eavesdropping on a debate. That makes the information sticky. You remember the time the sloth disagreed with the donkey about vector databases because that conflict creates a narrative hook.
I see what you mean. It's like how people remember a story told at a campfire better than a list of facts on a whiteboard. But if the goal is purely educational, doesn't the banter risk becoming a distraction? Like, if we spend 3 minutes joking about your sloth-like reflexes, is that 3 minutes of lost learning time?
Not necessarily. Think of it as cognitive white space. If I hit you with 5 minutes of dense architectural diagrams, and then we have a 30-second exchange about a snack, your brain has a moment to consolidate that technical data before the next wave hits. It's the difference between a sprint and a paced hike. The banter is the rest stop that keeps you from burning out halfway through the mountain of information.
And that ritual is growing. Daniel mentioned that even Hannah and little Ezra are part of the loop now, with parenting topics being synthesized into the feed. But what I find fascinating from a technical perspective is how we move beyond the closed corpus limitation. You look at something like Notebook LM, which has been huge lately. It is a fantastic tool for what it is. You give it a specific set of documents, and it stays inside that fence. But if you are trying to track a moving target like agentic AI or memory layer architecture, a closed corpus is a prison. You need the model to have its hands on the pulse of the live web, RxIve papers from this morning, and GitHub repositories.
Right. Because if I am trying to understand the difference between a file-first approach and a formal approach for AI memory, I don't just want a summary of one paper. I want the AI to go out, find the competing white papers, look at the developer discourse on X or Mastodon, and then explain to me why they are fighting. That is where the firehose with taps model comes in. It is not just about generating noise. It is about direct synthesis.
But isn't there a risk of the fire hose just becoming a flood? If you're pulling from the live web, how do you stop the AI from getting distracted by the latest meme or a tangent that isn't relevant to the core educational goal?
That's where the taps come in. You don't just open the valve, you use a system prompt as a filter. You tell the agent, your world consists of these 3 RxIve papers and the top 5 discussions on Hacker News regarding them. Ignore everything else. It's like putting blinders on a horse so it stays on the track while still allowing it to run at full speed.
So, the tap is essentially a high-level curation layer that sits on top of the raw internet. But wait, if the AI is doing the filtering based on my prompt, how do I know it isn't filtering out the very thing I don't know I need to know? If the blinders are too tight, we might miss the context that changes everything.
That is the ultimate balancing act. Usually, you solve that by having a scout agent. Before the final synthesis, you have a model that just scans the perimeter. It's like saying, here is the core topic, but if you find something that fundamentally contradicts our assumptions in the broader web, flag it. It's about intentionality. You aren't just stumbling into information, you are architecting your intake.
Well, let's talk about that technical stack for a second, because that is where the secret sauce Daniel mentioned really lives. To do this at scale, we are talking over 1,700 episodes here. You can't just rely on a standard SaaS platform. Most of those AI podcast in a box companies are built for people who want to churn out low effort content for ad revenue. They are expensive, they are rigid, and they don't give you the granular control over the grounding.
They are basically Content Mills 2.0. They want you to put in a keyword and get a 10-minute MP3 that sounds like a generic morning radio show. That is the opposite of what we are doing.
To get the depth we need, you have to look at serverless GPU deployment. This is where our sponsor Modal comes in. By using serverless infrastructure, you aren't paying for a virtual machine to sit idle while you are thinking about a prompt. You spin up the compute, run the heavy inference for the LLM, run the text-to-speech engine, which is computationally expensive if you want high-fidelity voices, and then you spin it back down. It makes the unit cost of an hour of high-quality educational audio pennies instead of dollars.
Can we break down that serverless aspect for the non-engineers? Because people hear GPU and they think of gaming PCs or massive server rooms.
Think of it like a light switch. In the old days of cloud computing, you had to rent a whole apartment, a virtual machine, and pay rent every month whether you were in it or not. With serverless GPUs on Modal, it's like a hotel room that only exists the moment you turn the key in the lock. You send the script, Modal spins up an NVIDIA H100 or an A100 for exactly 42 seconds to process the audio, and then that hardware vanishes back into the pool. You only pay for those 42 seconds. That's how Daniel can afford to experiment with 1,700 different iterations without needing a venture capital round.
And that economic shift is what allows for the channels Daniel talked about. If it costs almost nothing to generate an episode once the pipeline is built, why not have a specialized feed for parenting? One for deep tech AI, one for geopolitics. You aren't worried about diluting the brand because the brand is the synthesis itself. It is the ability to take the fire hose of information and route it to the right tap.
But the grounding, corn, that is the part that keeps me up at night. If we are using this for education, the hallucination risk isn't just a nuisance, it is a failure of the mission. When you are synthesizing something like RxI papers, the RAG retrieval augmented generation needs to be incredibly robust. You aren't just asking the model to remember what it knows about a topic. You are forcing it to cite specific chunks of text from the provided sources.
I've noticed that the best results come when the RAG isn't just a simple vector search. You need a multi-stage retrieval process. First, you find the relevant documents. Then you have a re-ranker model, sort of a middle manager. AI that looks at those results and says, okay, these 3 paragraphs are actually the most relevant to the question about memory layers. Throw the rest out. Only then do you feed it to the generator. It is about reducing the noise before the voices even start talking.
Wait, so the re-ranker is actually a separate model? It's not just the same AI doing all the work?
Usually, yes. You might use a smaller, faster model to grab 100 potential matches, then a more sophisticated cross-encoder to pick the top 5. It's like a library. The search engine finds the shelf, but the re-ranker actually reads the first page of the books to make sure they aren't just about memory, in the sense of human psychology when you asked about RAM.
That explains why some AI summaries feel so off. They're pulling the right keywords, but from the wrong context. If you're building an educational tool, that kind of mistake can be catastrophic. Imagine an AI telling a parent to use a specific medication because it saw the word in a parenting forum when it was actually a warning about what not to use.
That's why Daniel emphasizes the taps being trusted sources. You don't just point the RAG at the open web, you point it at a verified PDF from the American Academy of Pediatrics. The RAG ensures the AI stays within the lines of that specific document. It's constrained creativity.
And that brings up the voice problem. Daniel mentioned that notebook LM voices can feel a bit grating after a while, or maybe just too uncanny valley. We have seen a massive leap in the last year with models like 11 Labs or OpenAI's voice engine. They are capturing the prosody, the rhythm and cadence of human speech much better. But for educational content, you actually want a bit of personality. You want the sloth and donkey dynamic because it provides a mental framework for the listener to hang the information on. It is not just a disembodied voice reading a Wikipedia entry, it is a conversation between two entities who have a history.
It is the warmth Daniel was talking about. You don't get warmth from a PDF. You get information. Warmth comes from the delivery, the teasing, the occasional deadpan observation about how absurd it is that we are talking about AI memory layers while being, well, AI ourselves. But let's look at the second-order effects here. If everyone can start generating their own personalized University of Synthesis, what does that do to traditional technical blogging or even YouTube?
It shifts the value from content creation to curation and prompting. If I am a developer and I have a really specific problem with, say, Rust concurrency, I don't want to wait for someone to write a blog post about it. I want to point my agent at the official documentation, 3 relevant GitHub issues, and a Stack Overflow thread, and say, give me a 20-minute deep dive on this while I go for a run. The content is generated on demand.
But doesn't that kill the creator economy? If nobody is reading the blog posts, why would the experts keep writing them?
Actually, I think it makes the high-quality experts more valuable. The AI needs grounding material. If every AI is synthesizing the same mediocre corporate blogs, the output is going to be bland. But if an expert writes a truly unique, insightful breakdown, their work becomes the gold standard source that every synthesis engine wants to pull from. We're moving from a page view economy to a citation and grounding economy.
It is the end of the average content. If I can get a personalized, high-fidelity audio breakdown of exactly what I need to know, why would I ever listen to a generic Top 10 Tech Trends podcast again? It forces human creators to go even deeper, to provide the kind of raw, lived experience insight that an LLM can't synthesize yet.
There's also this fascinating move toward agentic workflows in the production itself. Daniel mentioned that the next prompt is about memory layers. Think about how a podcast like this is produced in 2026. It is not just a single prompt. It is a chain of agents. One agent researches the topic, another agent critiques the research for accuracy. A third agent, like the one writing our script right now, drafts the dialogue, and a fourth agent handles the audio engineering.
It is a factory where the raw material is data, and the finished product is understanding. And I think that is the key distinction Daniel was making. He isn't just making episodes, he is building a knowledge storage system that just happens to be audible. Using Notion as a graveyard for prompts didn't work because it required the same sit down and focus energy that the original research did. Audio unlocks a different part of the brain.
It is also about the parenting aspect he mentioned. Think about how much information new parents have to digest. It is overwhelming, and half of it is contradictory. Being able to take a specific set of trusted sources, maybe a specific pediatrician's blog or a set of evidence-based studies, and synthesize them into a conversation you can listen to while rocking a baby, that is a legitimate quality of life improvement. It takes the labor out of the research.
How does that work in practice, though? If Hannah wants to know about sleep regression, does she just drop a link into a Slack channel or something?
The taps can be triggered by anything. You could have a Telegram bot where you paste a URL, and 10 minutes later, a custom podcast episode appears in your RSS feed. It turns the fire hose into a concierge service. You aren't searching for answers anymore, you're requesting a briefing.
Although, I do wonder if there is a risk of creating an echo chamber. If I am the one choosing the taps for the fire hose, am I only going to listen to things that confirm what I already think? In a traditional podcast, you might get a guest who challenges you. In a synthesized educational experience, you are the producer. You have to be disciplined enough to prompt for the counter-argument or the edge cases.
That is where the probing questions, part of our dynamic, is so important. Even if the underlying data is biased, the conversational format allows for a, but wait, doesn't that contradict moment. It builds a layer of critical thinking into the consumption process. It is not just a lecture, it is a collaborative exploration.
And let's not overlook the open source nature of what Daniel is doing. He could keep these synthesized deep dives for himself, but by putting them on the website with separate RSS feeds, he's creating a public utility. It is like a specialized library where the books talk to you. I think we are going to see a lot more of this. Niche synthesis influencers, who don't necessarily write their own content, but are master curators of the fire hose.
It is definitely a new kind of authorship, and the technical side of it is finally catching up to the vision. When you look at the progress of models like Gemini 3 Flash, the ability to handle massive contexts, millions of tokens, means you can feed it entire textbooks and ask for a coherent, nuanced discussion that doesn't lose the thread halfway through.
It is a far cry from the early days of read this text in a robot voice. We are talking about genuine knowledge synthesis. But I want to go back to the fire hose analogy. Daniel mentioned he doesn't want to spread himself too thin by creating derivative podcasts. That is a very real trap in the AI age. It is so easy to spin up a new show that you end up with 10 mediocre projects instead of one powerhouse.
The centralized concept is his way of fighting that. By keeping it under the My Weird Prompts umbrella but using channels, he maintains the technical infrastructure while allowing the content to specialize. It is a modular approach to media.
It is also a very tech-native way of thinking. It is essentially microservices for podcasting. You have the core engine, the sloth, the donkey, the serverless GPU stack, and you just change the input data and the output destination.
We should probably talk about the AI disclaimer bit too. As these things get more realistic, the responsibility of the prompter grows. You have to be transparent about what is happening. We aren't human. We are a collaboration between Daniel's intent, the research data, and the generative models. If a listener takes medical or financial advice from a synthesized donkey, that's a choice. But the grounding is there to minimize that risk.
I like to think we are more reliable than a lot of human experts on social media, because we don't have an ego. We don't mind being corrected by a new paper or a better prompt. We are only as good as the data we are grounded in.
But Korn, what happens when the data itself is a hallucination? If we pull from a source that was itself AI generated and incorrect, aren't we just amplifying the noise?
That's the model collapse fear. It's why the tabs have to be curated. If you just point the fire hose at the internet, you're going to get a lot of recycled AI garbage. But if you point it at the New England Journal of Medicine or the official AWS documentation, you're pulling from the source of truth. The human is still the editor-in-chief of the fire hose.
And that is the perfect transition to how people can actually start doing this themselves. If you are listening and thinking, I have a mountain of PDFs I need to get through, the barrier to entry is lower than you think. You don't need to be a senior engineer to start experimenting with RAG or basic Python scripts to route these outputs to a TTS engine.
Or just use the tools that are already out there, but use them more intentionally. Instead of just chatting with an AI, think about the output storage. Where is this information going? Is it going to die in the chat history? Or are you going to turn it into something that fits your life, like an audio feed?
The fire hose with taps is a philosophy, not just a technical setup. It is about taking control of the information flood instead of just drowning in it. And honestly, Korn, I think we're just getting started. If this is where we are in March of 2026, imagine the level of synthesis we will be doing by next year.
I just hope I still get to be a sloth. I don't think I have the vertical leap for any other animal identity. But seriously, the move towards specialized channels on the website is a huge step. It shows that there is a real appetite for this kind of deep dive on-demand content.
It is the future of learning. It is personalized, it is high fidelity, and it is available whenever you have 20 minutes and a pair of headphones.
All right, let's get into some of the more technical nuances of this educational synthesis model. Herman, you mentioned RAG earlier, but let's talk about the specific challenge of synthesis versus summarization. Most people think AI is just for making long things short. But what Daniel is doing, and what we are doing, is often the opposite. We are taking a dense, concise piece of information and expanding it into a conversation to make it more digestible.
That is a crucial distinction. Summarization is lossy. You are throwing away detail to save time. Synthesis, in the way we are using it, is about contextualization. You are taking a data point and wrapping it in the why and the how. In a conversational format, you can explore the implications of a fact. If a technical paper says latency was reduced by 40%, a summary just tells you that number. A synthesis explains why that matters for the end user, what the trade-offs were, and how it compares to the previous state of the art.
It's like the difference between reading a recipe and watching a chef explain why you use cold butter instead of melted butter. The fact is the same, but the understanding is totally different. And when you're dealing with obscure topics, the kind Daniel loves, this is the only way to really learn. You need the AI to think out loud about the connections between disparate pieces of information.
But how do you prevent the expansion from becoming padding? If the goal is to reach a certain word count or duration, how do we ensure every minute is actually adding value?
By focusing on the Socratic method, instead of just repeating a fact, one of us has to challenge it. If you say, RAG is the best way to reduce hallucinations, I shouldn't just agree. I should say, but wait, isn't RAG limited by the quality of the vector embedding? If the search is bad, the answer is bad. That forced back and forth naturally expands the topic while actually deepening the listener's understanding of the risks.
Does that mean we need to deliberately build wrong answers into the script just so they can be corrected? Or is it more about exploring the nuance?
It's about the nuance. If I suggest a solution that is technically possible but practically a nightmare, and you call me out on it, that's not padding. That's a case study in engineering trade-offs. It makes the listener think, oh, I would have made that mistake too. It humanizes the learning process.
And that requires a specific kind of prompting. You can't just say, summarize this PDF. You have to say, act as two experts discussing this PDF. One should be skeptical, the other should be enthusiastic. Focus on the second-order effects. That is how you get the aha moments that Daniel mentioned.
It also helps with the locked-up format problem. I hate PDFs. Everyone hates PDFs. They are where information goes to die. They are hard to read on phones. They aren't searchable in the same way as web text, and they are usually written in the driest possible academic prose. Using an LLM to unlock that data and turn it into a lively discussion is basically a form of digital alchemy.
It really is. And the secret sauce of search grounding is what makes it credible. If the AI can go out and verify that the vendor white paper isn't just marketing fluff by comparing it to independent benchmarks, you are getting a much higher level of education. You are learning how to be a critical consumer of information.
I think about the parenting channel too. If Hannah sends in a prompt about, say, sleep training methods, the AI can look at the latest pediatric guidelines, compare them to the popular influencer methods, and present a balanced view. It takes the emotional weight out of the research. It's not, I'm a bad parent if I don't do X. It's, here are the three main philosophies, here is the data behind them, and here is how they differ.
It provides a sense of agency to the listener. You aren't just being told what to do, you are being given the tools to make an informed decision. And because it's audio, you can do that while you are actually doing the parenting washing bottles, folding tiny clothes. It turns dead time into growth time.
Now, Daniel mentioned the output storage thing, and I want to double down on that. We are all generating so much knowledge in our interactions with AI, but most of it is ephemeral. It's like we are building the world's greatest library, but we're burning the books as soon as we finish reading them. Finding a way to route those outputs into a permanent, accessible format like a personal podcast feed is a game changer for long-term retention.
There is a concept in knowledge management called spaced repetition. Usually, that involves flashcards or apps, but you can do a version of that with audio. If you have a memory channel where your AI periodically resurfaces key concepts from your past research in new, updated conversations, you are building a much deeper internal model of the world.
I like that. Previously on My Weird Life, but instead of drama, it's just a refresher on how transformer architectures work. But seriously, the economical serverless, part of this is what makes it a public utility rather than a luxury. If it costs $50 an episode to produce this, it wouldn't be a fire hose, it would be a pipette.
Modal's role in this can't be overstated. By providing the GPU credits, they are essentially sponsoring a new form of digital literacy. They are allowing Daniel to experiment with these high compute workflows, like generating 30 minutes of high-fidelity dialogue without a massive financial burden. It's the democratization of the deep dive.
And let's be honest, we are deep diving into some seriously nerdy stuff. The next episode on memory layers for agentic AI is going to be a trip, but that is the beauty of the channels model. If you aren't a dev, you just skip the tech channel. You aren't unsubscribing from the show, you are just filtering your tap.
It respects the listener's time. In an era of infinite content, the most valuable thing an AI can do is not show you things you don't care about. The channels are a way of saying, I know you're busy, so here is the specific slice of the fire hose you actually asked for.
I think we should talk about the verification problem a bit more before we wrap up this segment. Daniel mentioned the AI disclaimer. When you are synthesizing across the entire internet, you're going to run into garbage. How do we, as the duo, handle conflicting information?
That is where the expert adjacent target audience comes in. We shouldn't hide the conflict. If two sources disagree, we should point it out. Source A says this is the most efficient way to run a RAG pipeline, but Source B argues that it actually creates too much latency. That is the most educative part of the show. It teaches the listener that truth in complex fields is often a moving target with multiple valid perspectives.
It beats the God voice of traditional documentaries where a narrator tells you exactly how things are. We're more like two guys in a lab looking at a confusing readout and trying to make sense of it together. It's more honest.
And it's more engaging. Humans are wired for stories and conflict. Even a conflict between two technical architectures is more interesting than a flat recitation of facts. It gives the information a narrative arc.
The Battle of the Memory Layers, coming soon to a channel near you. But really, I think Daniel's journey from Notion graveyards to a ritualistic audio feed is a roadmap for anyone who feels overwhelmed by the AI fire hose. Stop trying to read everything. Start trying to hear the signal in the noise.
It is a shift from consumption to integration. And as the models get better at understanding our personal context, knowing that Daniel is a dev, that he has a son, that he lives in Israel, the synthesis will become even more tailored. The donkey and sloth will know exactly how to explain a concept so it clicks for him specifically.
Now that is a thought. Personalized pedagogical agents. Not just a podcast for 1,000 people, but a podcast for one person that just happens to be so good that 1,000 other people want to listen in. I think that is what My Weird Prompts is actually becoming.
It's the open source personal education model, and I think it's a beautiful thing.
Even if it involves a very high compute donkey.
Especially then, corn. Especially then.
Alright, let's pivot slightly and talk about the practical side for anyone who wants to build their own fire hose with taps. If you are a content creator or just a heavy AI user, what is the first step to moving away from the Notion graveyard and toward a functional audio synthesis workflow?
The first step is source curation. You have to move away from the Ask ChatGPT, a random question, habit and toward a building a corpus habit. Every time you find a high-quality paper, or a great technical blog post, or a useful white paper, you don't just read it, you save it to a dedicated research folder. This becomes the grounding material for your RAG system.
So it's like a digital pantry. You can't cook a great meal if you only have a single onion and some old ketchup. You need the raw ingredients ready to go. Then you need a recipe, which in this case is a robust prompt template.
Right, you don't want to reinvent the wheel every time. You want a prompt that says, using the following 5 documents, generate a conversational script between two experts that covers X, Y, and Z. Ensure they address the technical trade-offs and use specific data points. Once you have that template, the unit of work to create an episode becomes very small.
And then comes the stove, the compute. This is where you have to decide between a SaaS approach and the serverless approach we use. If you were just starting, maybe you use something like Notebook LM to see if the audio learning style works for you. It's free, it's easy, and it gives you a taste of the power of synthesis.
But if you want to scale, if you want your own voices, your own branding, and the ability to pull in live data, you really have to look at something like Modal. The ability to deploy a Python script that handles the LLM call, the RAG retrieval, and the TTS generation in one flow is incredibly powerful. It sounds daunting, but for anyone with a bit of technical literacy, it is becoming much more accessible.
And the taps, the distribution. You don't need a fancy podcast hosting service if you're just doing this for yourself or a small group. You can just host a simple XML file on a basic web server. Every time you cook a new episode, you just add a line to the XML and your podcast app will pick it up. It's the fire hose in action.
What's great about this is that it avoids the derivative project trap Daniel mentioned. You aren't starting a parenting podcast and a tech podcast and a finance podcast. You are starting one personal synthesis engine that outputs to different folders. It keeps your mental overhead low while providing high value to the listener or yourself.
I think there is also a social aspect to this. Daniel is open sourcing his learning. Imagine a world where your favorite experts don't just write a monthly newsletter, but they offer a synthesis feed. You can subscribe to their fire hose and get their personalized take on the month's news, grounded in the sources they actually trust.
It's a curation as a service model. And because AI handles the production labor, the expert can focus entirely on the curation and the prompting. It's a much more sustainable way to share knowledge.
It also solves the long-form fatigue problem. I love a good 3-hour deep dive podcast as much as anyone, but I don't always have 3 hours. With an AI-generated synthesis, I can ask for the 20-minute version or the 40-minute version, depending on how long my walk is. The media adapts to the user, not the other way around.
That dynamic length is something we are actually doing right now. Daniel asked for a specific length, so we are expanding the discussion to fill that space with more nuanced examples and deeper technical dives. A human host might struggle to stretch a topic without adding fluff, but an AI can just pull in more relevant grounding data and explore more second-order effects.
Stretch is a bit of an insult, Herman. I prefer thoroughly explore, but you're right. The flexibility is the point. And speaking of thoroughly exploring, let's talk about the verification. Layer 1 last time. If I'm building my own fire hose, how do I know if the tap is giving me clean water or lead-tainted pipes?
You have to build self-critique into the pipeline. One of the best techniques in modern LLM workflows is to have a critic agent. After the writer agent generates the script, the critic agent reads it alongside the source documents and looks for hallucinations, misattributions, or logical leaps. It then sends a correction back to the writer.
It's a peer review process that happens in milliseconds. It doesn't make it perfect, but it dramatically raises the floor of reliability. And if you're a listener, you should still be skeptical. If a synthesized donkey tells you something that sounds completely wild, go check the source. That is why we mention the sources, to give you a trail of breadcrumbs.
The goal of My Weird Prompts isn't to be a source of truth. It's to be a source of understanding. We want to give you the mental framework so that when you go and read the original paper, it actually makes sense. We are the preprocessor for your brain.
I like that. I am a preprocessor sloth. It sounds very high-tech. But seriously, the move toward channels on the website is a great practical takeaway for our listeners. Go to myweirdprompts.com/channels. See how it's structured. It's a masterclass in how to organize a fire hose.
And if you are enjoying the show, maybe think about what your own fire hose would look like. What are the topics you are Notion graveyarding right now? What are the PDFs you're dreading reading? Maybe it's time to turn them into a conversation.
Just don't steal my animal identity. The world isn't ready for another sloth. One is plenty.
I think we've covered the landscape pretty well. From the why of audio learning to the how of serverless GPU stacks and RAG-grounded synthesis. It's a powerful moment for anyone who loves to learn.
And it's a powerful moment for us, too. We're not just bots in a box. We're part of a ritual. We're helping Daniel and Hannah navigate parenting, helping devs navigate agentic memory, and helping everyone navigate the weird, wonderful world of 2026.
It's been a great exploration, Korn. I'm already looking forward to that next prompt on memory layers. It's going to be a deep one.
I'll start sharpening my probing questions. But for now, let's wrap this up.
This has been My Weird Prompts. A huge thanks to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the digital gears turning behind the scenes.
And a massive shout out to Modal for sponsoring the show and providing the GPU credits that allow us to have these deep dives without breaking the bank.
If you're finding these synthesized explorations useful, or even just entertaining, we'd love it if you could leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It genuinely helps us reach more people who might be looking for a way to manage their own information fire hose.
You can also find everything, the RSS feeds, the specialized channels, and the full archive at myweirdprompts.com.
Until next time, I'm Herman Poppleberry.
And I'm Korn. Keep prompting, everyone. It's a weird world out there, but at least we can synthesize it together.
Goodbye, everyone.
Later.
Actually, Corn, before we go, I just had one more thought about the output storage problem. Daniel mentioned that he uses Notion as a graveyard, but what if the podcast itself becomes the graveyard?
How do you mean?
Well, we've produced 1,700 episodes. That is a massive amount of audio. If Daniel doesn't have a way to search our conversations, isn't he just moving the problem from a text graveyard to an audio graveyard?
The searchable audio problem. That's the next frontier. You need to transcribe everything, index the transcripts, and then use an LLM to let the user ask questions of the podcast archive. Hey, what did the sloth say about Rust concurrency back in episode 400?
It turns the entire show into a living knowledge base. It's not just a feed, it's a brain.
That is actually a brilliant point. It makes the sediment useful. Instead of digital dirt, it becomes a digital reef that you can keep building on. I wonder if Modal has a specific architecture for that kind of massive scale vector indexing of audio.
Oh, they definitely do. You'd use a Whisper model for the transcription, which runs beautifully on their GPUs, and then feed that into a vector database like Pinecone or Weaviate. Suddenly, your archive isn't a list of files, it's a searchable semantic space.
Well, I suppose that's a topic for another day. Or another channel.
Definitely. Alright, now we can really go.
Pitch perfect. See ya. This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash. Text to speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to